Hello and welcome. The World Health Organization has resumed trials of the drug hydrochloroquine as part of a solidarity trial to finding a cure to COVID. Now, the trial had been stopped because of a study that had shown that the drug was not working as advertised, so to speak. Now, this study has itself come in under a lot of cloud, as have the authors behind it and the company that is managing the data, thanks to an investigative article that appeared in the press. So the question we are asking is really, what do we know more today about hydrochloroquine, which is clearly a controversial drug in many parts of the country, but continues to be administered by doctors in countries like India? So number one. Number two, is there any more learning that we have today which might actually help us point towards the cure to COVID, if not cure, at least mitigation of the disease in the manner that we are encountering it amongst patients across the country? So to discuss this, I'm joined by someone who's been writing and speaking on this issue, Dr. SP Kalantri, Director and Professor of Medicine at the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Medical Sciences and Kasturba Hospital in Sevagram near Nagpur. Dr. Kalantri also has a master's in public health in epidemiology from the School of Public Health in California. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Kalantri. So, the first question is, what do you make of this stop-start that we've seen in the WHO's actions?
Well, ever since the COVID-19 outbreak emerged in the last 3 months, isn't it? All over the world, there has been a lot of chaos, fear, panic, fear of unknown. And because it's a new disease discovered just a couple of months back, so there was no way for the scientific community and researchers to know, is there any known cure? Can we prevent this drug? Do we have very potent therapies? Are these therapies safe? Are these therapies effective? Isn't it? So people in desperate situations, the problem is that in desperate situations, even the medical communities often abandon science and abandon logical reasoning. So as a physician, if I put myself at the patient's bedside and my patient is very serious in the ICU, often I feel that come what may, I must save my patient. And this creates a huge tension between being a physician and a researcher. How do I act? And that is exactly what is happening so far as COVID-19 epidemic is concerned. People started now clutching almost every straw that came their way. This could be anti-malarials, as old as chloroquine, about 80 years old drug, hydroxychloroquine, about 50 years old drug, antivirals, interleukin blockers, steroids, convalescent plasma, and so on. And this created a lot of unnecessary chaos and confusion and also controversy.
The WHO has clearly taken a position that, the first position it seemed to take was that this was not working. And there is pressure, obviously, from many countries, including the United States, where the president himself has been advocating the use of hydrochloroquine. And you also have a situation where in India, doctors are administering it. So my question really is, how do you then assess, whether it's really working or not working? Because I'm assuming some of this feedback is based on actual practice or what is how patients are responding to this drug.
So what happened is that if you go in the history of research, so far as hydroxychloroquine is concerned, the initial studies came from France and China. Now, unfortunately, these studies were extremely poorly designed. They were not properly monitored. The sample size was very small. And these studies were simply not designed to answer the very question. And the question was that, is hydroxychloroquine a safe, effective drug in either prevention or treatment of COVID-19? So given that their numbers were very small, there was no control group, there were huge biases and confounders that distorted the study results, the clinically meaningful outcomes was not there. These studies created a lot of hype. But when these studies were dissected and researchers started looking at these studies very critically and did a critical appraisal of these studies, well, they found that these studies were terrible studies. Unfortunately, that was a time when the virus was on, the whole world was seized with fear, and people suddenly started feeling that, well, hydroxychloroquine is a magic bullet. And if you look at hydroxychloroquine, people argued that, well, it's an 80-year-old drug. It has been in use for conditions like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. It has worked in all ways. The physicians are very comfortable with these drugs. There are not many side effects with this drug. And if biologically this drug has worked well in petri dishes in microbiology, isn't it? Well, there's no reason as to why it shouldn't also exert its antiviral properties so far as human beings is concerned. But the problem is that in real science, many things that look very promising on paper many things that work very well on animals or in petri dishes or in lab experiments, when they are translated and they are tested in the rigors of randomized controlled trials, these so-called magical bullets, they fall flat, and well, we find that well, all that glitters is not gold. And that is exactly what happened with hydroxychloroquine. The same thing happened in India, isn't it? Now, physicians all over the country suddenly thought that here is a drug, and this drug has a number of virtues. For example, it's very cheap. A tablet of hydroxychloroquine in India costs only 5 rupees. It has to be taken orally. You need to take it either daily or on a weekly basis. People have a long association and long friendship with hydroxychloroquine, and therefore they thought that here is a very cheap, convenient, easily available, oral, inexpensive drug that has a proven benefits in certain other conditions. So let us try it out. So people thought that let me at least do something for my patients for either preventing or controlling this outbreak.
Right. So, but in the case of the WHO action, now the report that came out that was authored by Mandeep Mehra and other individuals actually said that it's not working. And the questions that were raised about the company itself and their past actions and so on. So, I mean, have you gone deeper into this, or because this is, I mean, this report seems to in some ways be in confirmation with what you're saying. But this is the report that's been discredited, and the WHO has resumed trials.
Okay. On 22nd May, now this is a landmark day in the history of hydroxychloroquine. Lancet published at 5 p.m. one of the largest studies on hydroxychloroquine ever. 96,000 patients pooled from 651 hospitals from 6 continents, isn't it? Huge data on hydroxychloroquine, and the study started asking the research question that was in the mind of everyone, public, policymakers, doctors, physicians, everyone. Is hydroxychloroquine safe and effective? And the study pooled data from 651 hospitals and suggested that all things being equal, patients who receive hydroxychloroquine are more likely to die, 30% more mortality. They are more likely to develop an abnormal cardiac rhythm which could turn fatal. They are more at a risk of a low blood sugar if they are diabetic. And therefore, the study very strongly suggested that, well, hydroxychloroquine, far from being a saver, it's a killer, isn't it? And therefore, it urged caution on the use of hydroxychloroquine in seriously ill patients all across the globe, isn't it? So that day, I still remember that day, 22nd May evening, in the entire world was all eyes on this Lancet paper, and people thought that, well, perhaps for the first time we have an evidence that, well, this drug doesn't well, we need to treat this drug with caution, and this drug might kill more people than it is trying to save, isn't it? But as soon as this study came out, well, the researchers, the policymakers, authors, physicians, everyone started looking at this study with very close eyes, with the microscopic eyes, and they found some problems. So the problems were that, well, it's a huge data coming from 651 hospitals. The people were wondering about the accuracy of data. People were wondering about the scientific integrity. People were considering whether the ethics approvals were obtained from each hospital. People were concerned about the privacy and individuality of each patient. And people also started wondering at the accuracy of this data coming from countries like Australia and Africa, where they thought that, well, these numbers don't make sense. So probably these numbers don't match with the national registry numbers. And the biggest problem was that the people started looking at this data and their accuracy and started questioning the accuracy because these data were not shared. And Lancet was one of the first medical journals in the world which said that during an outbreak, it is an ethical imperative that all numbers and all data must be shared. There's nothing called secrecy so far as this data is concerned. So people started questioning the ethics of this trial. People started questioning the integrity of this trial. People started questioning the accuracy of these numbers. And therefore, both NEJM as well as Lancet, they published their letters of concern. And they also asked the principal investigators from the United States, the 4 cardiologists, to respond to these concerns. The researchers also wondered that given the enormous implications of this trial and given the fact that this trial ultimately led World Health Organization to stop the hydroxychloroquine arm in its solidarity trial, it makes sense that the study results and all those numbers must be assessed independently by an independent body like World Health Organization, or the editor of Lancet, Mr. Richard Hutton, must appoint an independent research body to look critically at this data and analyze data. So this trial, instead of throwing more light on hydroxychloroquine and its efficacy, now generated more heat and led to more dust. And probably it will take some time for this Mr. Mandeep Mehra to respond, to clarify these several issues, to light again. Probably the light would again start coming from those dark tunnels, and probably we will get to know that whether this data can be applied and extrapolated to the rest of the world as well.
Right. Okay. So let me come to the larger question, Dr. Kalantri. So, you know, the number of cases are rising, and I'm in Mumbai, and this is a hotspot in a hotspot in many ways. Now, how do you see it going forward? I mean, doctors have to respond to patients. You yourself pointed out the conundrum when you're seated beside a patient who is obviously, let's say, becoming more severe. And what is the treatment path that can be, taken, particularly for, let's say, moderate to severe cases? And I'm not talking about critical care cases. And how do you see the path going forward, particularly in the next 30, 40 years?
I think it is very important for physicians and as well as researchers to draw lessons from the past. And I will take you back to 2014 when the Ebola outbreak occurred, isn't it? And it had hit the hundreds of thousands of individuals all over the world. About 30,000 people died, and people started very desperately trying some old and as well as some new medicines for Ebola. So the people tried chloroquine, they tried hydroxychloroquine, they tried antivirals, they tried steroids. So almost everything that could appeal to their intelligent minds. But the problem is, even today, Ebola has no cure. And the reason as to why Ebola has no cure, isn't it? If we draw an analogy between Ebola and COVID-19, sure, both are viral illnesses, we find that none of them was a randomized control trial. They were all observational trials. They were all based on small numbers. They were all based on anecdotes. They were all based on personal whims, fancies, one's own logical thinking. They often used off-label drugs. They often used these drugs for compassionate reason. But in real science, unless you have got a well-designed randomized control trial with a placebo group, which asks a very clinically meaningful question, isn't it? None of these attempts on the part of scientific community and researchers is ever going to answer the question, is this drug safe? So however much research that we do on hydroxychloroquine, and that is what the folly which we are in India are doing, isn't it? If we design more and more observational studies, isn't it, to look at the efficacy and safety of hydroxychloroquine, there is always a question which these studies don't answer. Compared to whom? The problem is that if you try out a drug and it works, we give all the credit to the drug. If it doesn't work, we say that, well, the disease was severe enough to kill a person. So we are never able to answer that whether this drug was really effective or it was not effective. And these observational studies, which our country is right now doing, is never going to answer the question whether these novel drugs, these off-label drugs, these old drugs are really helping in mitigating, preventing, or curing our patients with COVID-19 infection. So what we really need right now are well-designed randomized control trials. And let me take you to a fantastic trial which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the premier journals in the world, on remdesivir, an antiviral drug for the treatment of COVID-19. The credit goes to these researchers that they were able to start this trial somewhere in the mid-February, and just in 58 days, they were able to collect 1,100 individuals from 24 sites from 7 major countries in the world. And all that they did was that they asked a simple question, that all things being equal, in patients who are severely infected with COVID-19, is remdesivir compared to the current standard of care more effective in reducing mortality or lengthening the stay of hospital or reducing your chance of getting on a mechanical ventilator? The study very beautifully answered the question that yes, it marginally helps, probably does not have mortality benefits. So at least today we very clearly know whether the remdesivir helps or not. If we extend that analogy of remdesivir to hydroxychloroquine, it was possible and it is still possible in our country to plan out a well-designed randomized controlled trial to ultimately tell to the world that, well, there is a lot of hype, hope and hoopla around hydroxychloroquine. Does it really work or it doesn't work? Otherwise, we would be guilty of telling to the posterity that while the COVID-19 outbreak was on, so all that we did is that we continue to add fuel to the fire of confusion, isn't it? The time is that these are desperate times. There are absolutely no doubt about it. There are testing times so far as the physicians in the ICUs, hospitals. You come from Bombay and you must have seen the scene in the ICUs in the Bombay. They're extremely testing and trying times. But this is indeed a time to design a beautiful, large, multicentric, randomized controlled trial in our country. Test hydroxychloroquine and tell them that, well, it is saving life here. And I'm very sure that this trial can be done because, see, this country has 550 medical colleges. There are several large hospitals in the country like AIIMS, PGI, JIPMER. In Bombay, you have KEM, Sion, Nair, JJ. Down south, we have St. John's and so on. So this hospital can easily recruit a population of about 5,000 patients from all over the country, divide them into arms, and compare the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine placebo arms and straight away give an answer not only to the country but to the entire world about the safety and effectiveness. Unless we do that, well, we will be wasting our time, effort, money and resources, and probably by over the next few months, we will never be able to answer the question, what's exactly happening to the hydroxychloroquine? That controversy would still be live.
Right. Dr. Kalantri, thank you so much for throwing light on this, emphasizing the need for randomized controlled trials and essentially using research to take our next round of medical steps to fight this dreaded disease. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, welcome. The pleasure is mine.